This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Justin Waggoner, K-State Extension beef cattle specialist, begins today's show as he discusses multiple generations working together in agriculture. He says how their communication styles often differ. Keeping the show rolling is K-State Extension beef production specialist Emma Briggs, as she explains how hay waste changes with hay feeders that are used by cattle producers. K-State Research and Extension horticulture specialist Cynthia Domenghini ends today's show as she talks through how to start vegetable seeds. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner discussing his management minute from an ASI newsletter. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Justin, today talking about working with multiple generations, but first wanting to touch on why a beef cattle specialist is talking about some management.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic. It actually comes up a lot. And so a number of years ago, a former colleague in animal science really took note of the fact that many of our farms and ranchers are employers. They have 1 to 2 employees on an operation, but there really wasn't a lot of content, information that was directed toward those farms and ranches that was, on short topics like leadership or management or even generational differences like we're going to talk about today. And so we started this in the ASI newsletter, called it the Management Minute, for lack of a better term. Just some short articles to put some content out there that our county extension agents could use in their communication, but as well as their work, and just kind of covering the topic a little bit more in detail than what we were before. So recognizing that gap and providing some content.
And today, talking about working with multiple generations, and can you break down what are the different generations we might be seeing in agriculture?
Yeah, so I think agriculture in general is maybe somewhat unique, especially as we think about the different aspects of an operation and having, family members come back to an operation, kind of that traditional sense of the American farm or ranch. And so as we think about the different generations that are out there and how we loosely define those, right? We've all heard about millennials and maybe some about Gen Z and baby boomers, but what are the categories? Where do things start to fall out? And so, some of these names do change. So, if we think about the generations that are out there today, we'll kind of go back to, what I'll call the silent generation. And that's really from 1928 to 45. So these would be individuals that are, currently maybe in their 80s in terms of age range. Then after that, we have the baby boomers from 1946 to 65. So I think of these as individuals that are in their 60s. Then the Generation X, which would be about 1965 to 1980. The millennials, 1981 to 2000. Then we've got Generation Z from 2001 to 2010. Now we're starting to talk about Generation Alpha. And then Beta, as I understand it, is going to kick off in individuals that are born in 2025. Sometimes the ranges of birth year do change a little bit depending on the source, but I think it's really interesting to think about the characteristics that go along with each one of these generations, and then how all of those come together on a farm or ranch that might be working together.
What is one characteristic that you see as differs a fair amount from generation to generation?
One of the places that I really noted it, a lot of times in my work, I get to work directly with ranchers in terms of their beef cattle operation. And so, I was working with an enterprise or an operation, and, I've got the grandfather, the son, the grandson, all kind of sitting around the pickup. And you start to think about just the different mechanisms of communication there. And I communicate with all three of these individuals, right? On one hand, we've got a person who really prefers direct face-to-face communication. And, then we've got, the grandson that's definitely more in the mode of texting, right? And just more modern, email and texting are very common, right? So the easiest thing for me to think about in terms of those generational differences is just the preference or the different ways in which they communicate, right? That's where I think I see it the most in my day-to-day work as a beef cattle specialist, is just in how those different generations communicate, their preferred methods of communication, and how they all work together.
How have you seen families or maybe yourself navigate those different preferences of communication?
So I think what you tend to see is the younger generation actually kind of pulls the older generation along. That's what I tend to see. They start to, if we think about computer usage, right? I would argue that one of the greatest things that was online auctions, right? Every farmer rancher loves a good auction, right? So as you think about computer usage and how that really changed the modality of that older individual that now is, actively participating in online auctions or something like that. That's a really great metaphor for, how society and change and, kind of the younger generation kind of bringing that older generation up to speed in terms of communication. So I think there's some great examples out there of that younger generation really bringing that older generation, if you will, kind of up to speed or embracing the new technologies. That isn't always the case, right? You and I talked earlier, kind of off air here about, change and kind of being set in your ways. And this is the preferred method that, some individuals just prefer to communicate in this particular way. But I think it is a challenge, right? Especially if we've got employees that might fall in those different generational categories, especially as we think about those older generations, possibly being in more of a leadership role, trying to realize how they need to communicate with that younger generation that's now working for them or coming back into the farm or ranching operation.
Is it also sometimes the younger generation just needing to go with what maybe that older generation wants?
Yeah, I think there's a fair bit of give and take, right? You kind of have to just figure out what works for the operation. I don't think there's, necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think really communication is really one of the places where I see the big differences between the generations. And it's both a great example of the differences, but also, just the importance of how change occurs in an operation or how they choose to communicate with each other.
Justin, any recommendations for people who are in operations with multiple generations, kind of setting that expectation for how communication will be handled?
I think of workplace dynamics, right? And so I think it's very clear, especially if we have employees that might be younger, that prefer, texting or mobile phones or some of those platforms there, just to have that conversation, especially if it's going to be a situation where, hey, I'm going to be, in late today for some sort of reason, how do you want that to be communicated? Is that a direct phone call with a voicemail? Is a text message acceptable? I think having that conversation and setting those expectations up front can really be one of the best things to do or the best recommended practices for success that I've certainly seen in some operations.
What are some other difficulties that maybe you've seen happen when different generations are working together?
In terms of, how they prefer to get information, right? That's another one of the areas, as you think about extension and what you and I do and, the traditional producer meetings, I think that's one of the areas that there are some differences there. Is the younger generation is more of an independent learning generation a lot of times, where they're more willing to go out and find information, whereas some of those other generations really are they want to come to a producer meeting or an event and get that information, if that kind of makes sense. So I think that's another, kind of area. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a challenge. It's just a difference between the generations in terms of how they prefer to get information, if you will.
Justin, while we have you on, wanting to wrap up today's conversation with a few reminders about keeping cattle comfortable in the cool weather. Even though we might not be as cold as we are still pretty chilly.
That's right, Shelby. It's kind of, we transition a little bit here to talk about some of those issues. We always, tend to get very cold in Kansas in January, right? That's when we see those first, really sustained cold temperatures and how we need to manage and take care of cattle. We certainly know cold stress is a significant source of stress that's out there. What I oftentimes remind listeners when it comes especially on cows that are in extensive environments is that oftentimes one of the things that's accompanied by a winter storm is a reduction in grazing behavior. And at the same time, our energy expenditures on those cows are actually going up. So we really have this compounding effect of both cold stress with reduced grazing behavior. And so a lot of times what's really important is for us as producers to replace some of that grazed forage that's out there, but also at the same time provide additional energy in the form of supplementation. So oftentimes what I like to say is just think about the quality of forage that the cows are currently grazing, but maybe looking at a hay or a forage source or rolling out some hay that might be the next level of higher quality hay. And then some additional energy supplementation, whether that's coming from some sort of a cow cube, or maybe that's some additional grain, especially if those cold temperatures are going to be sustained for a significant length of time.
What is that temperature where cattle producers might need to provide their livestock with a little more feed?
We oftentimes think in terms of lower critical temperatures for cows, and that is also influenced by body condition on the cows. So if we have cows that are in body condition score of 5 that maybe have a little more fat cover than those thinner cows that are out there, those cows are going to be able to withstand colder temperatures better than those cows that are going to be thin. So oftentimes I think the cutoff for the lower critical temperature with a dry winter coat of being about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. And so as we go below that 18 degree mark, that's really where we start to see some of the implications of cold stress. But oftentimes, I think what's important to remember is, that's the daytime high, right? So we often see, our lows early in the morning, but think in terms of daytime highs. One of the good indications or good tools that we have out there is actually on the KSU Mesonet with the Cattle Comfort Index. It does not only heat stress, we talk about it a lot in the summertime, but also a cold stress forecast and so I would encourage your listeners to go out there, take a look at those. And really, as I think about cold stress, it's not necessarily, a one-day event. It's more that prolonged exposure to cold. And, if we think about the recent cold temperatures and snow and being at those temperatures or those that are below those lower critical temperatures on those cows for an extended period of time. So 2 to 3 days of cold stress is really where we probably need to start to intervene as producers in terms of our management and feeding programs.
That was K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. I will link resources that we talked about in today's show notes on acttoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about choosing the right hay feeder with K-State Extension Beef Production Specialist Emma Briggs. Emma, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to have me. Thank you for letting me join your talk today.
Emma, first time on Agriculture Today and pretty new employee to Kansas State University and K-State Research and Extension. So can you give us a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So like she said, my name is Emma Briggs. I originally grew up on a cow-calf ranch in Northern California. I went ahead and did a few more degrees. I got my bachelor's degree in animal science from Fresno State University, and then got my master's degree from Colorado State University with an emphasis in breeding and genetics, and then a PhD in ruminant nutrition from Oklahoma State. I started on faculty here at Kansas State University in September of 2024, so I am still relatively new, but I am stationed at the Agricultural Research Center in Hays, Kansas, and I have a 70% research, 30% extension appointment.
Emma, we're excited to have you join us, and as we're talking about choosing the right hay feeder, why for cattle producers is making that hay feeder selection something that's important?
Yeah, and so reducing hay waste is one of the main ways and one of the most simple ways that we can utilize in order to improve both efficiency and profitability for cattle operations, especially in Kansas. Every operation is different, but the type of feeder or the type of way that you feed your hay can significantly impact how much forage you feed during the winter, as well as how much can get wasted due to trampling or other environmental factors.
What are a few of the different types of hay feeders?
Yeah, and so I like to break these down into kind of 3 different categories, each of them having their own pros and cons. And so one design is what I like to call an open bottom feeder, or kind of like an ag shop feeder. It's very similar to the ones I used to build when I was in high school. They have an open bottom design. They're typically fairly light. Sometimes they're made out of plastic or metal, and they're really easy to move on their side, move around. And so it makes them very reasonable in that respect. But unfortunately, when they have an open bottom and they just kind of have that basic round design, it makes it really easy for cattle to pull the hay out and increase the amount of waste. So there's a lot of research that shows that 16 to 21% of that original bale weight can be wasted with these feeders, and most of it is due to the hay being pulled out and trampled on into cattle feces and urine. And so this type of waste can add up very quickly. The next type of feeder that I kind of put into the next classification is one that's very similar, but it has some type of sheeted bottom on the bottom of the feeder. And so this really only needs to come up 16 to 18 inches off the ground in order to be effective. And it's a really practical way to reduce hay waste and can typically be added on to existing feeders if needed. And so the sheeted bottom really helps in the later stages of feeding when that bale starts to collapse, and it helps maintain the feeding area, keeping it clean and making sure that the loose hay stays within reach of the cattle in the feeders, but they have typically less is pulled out. And so we've seen that about 39% reduction in hay waste compared to the open bottom design that I talked about thoroughly, with some researchers saying and some studies saying that it could be around 12% of the original bale weight is wasted in total, which is fairly good, all things considered. We're talking about, 1,000-pound bale. So the next one, the classification, which really has the most minimal waste, are feeders that have some type of basket or cone design. And in reality, what those features are actually doing is keeping the bale either suspended or keeping the upper third of the bale restricted in more of an upright position, so it doesn't kind of explode and go everywhere within the feeder. It really kind of holds it a little bit more tight. And so we've seen hay waste of a bale, percentage of a bale of 2 to 5% in some cases, which can really improve efficiency. Unfortunately, these cone and basket feeders are very heavy in nature. And so it can make it a little bit more difficult if you don't have some type of hydrobed or tractor to help you maneuver these different types of feeders. And the other issue I see sometimes is if you're trying to do some early weaned calves, sometimes calves have issues reaching all the way into some of these feeders. And since it does really hold it into the center, they just don't have the neck extension to get to that part. And so you kind of see that bale almost apple core shape.
Emma, is it worth then for people who maybe have open bottom rings to either get new rings or realistically maybe put something around that bottom?
I think so. And, we've done that before where, we just take some thin metal and we just weld it on and restrain it to kind of an open bottom feeder to help with some of that. And it's probably one of the most economic ways to improve one of your feeders is just trying to add that sheeted bottom to it, because the cone and basket model features on, if you're buying them from a company, typically are the most expensive.
When does most hay waste happen when a bale gets put into one of the feeders?
That's a really good question, and it really depends on the type of feeder. And so if we're talking about those open bottom feeders, we see the most hay waste occur within the first 24 hours of that bale being open. Whereas some of our more efficient feeders, like our cone design, we actually see more waste happen later on in the bale feeding process, because a lot of that more has to do with potential reachability, especially like I mentioned for calves later on in the feeding process.
And we also know sometimes hay also gets fed just by being unrolled. And what precautions should cattle producers take if that's how they're feeding their hay?
Yeah, and I think unrolling hay can be a really good option, especially if you have the land and the resources to do so. And so the one thing to keep in mind is that if you are going to unroll hay, you really need to make sure that you're only unrolling enough where cattle can clean up everything that you provide within the first 12 hours or so, or else that is going to likely just be converted to bedding. And so making sure that you're monitoring how much you roll out. The other downside to unrolling hay is that you really need to feed almost every day in order to make to have continual access, where if you were putting bales out in rings, you could potentially set out enough for a couple of days.
For people who are putting out hay in rings, sometimes is there a feeding strategy of maybe limiting that access to that hay bale?
Yeah, and that is a really good option too. There's been a lot of studies that say if you limit access to hay and you just give them about 5 to 12 hours, whatever works with your work schedule, or your schedule around the farm, but it can reduce waste because it overall decreases the dry matter intake that those cows are consuming of that hay. But it also doesn't affect performance, because we all know there's that one cow that'll just stand there and hog up the feeder 24 hours a day instead of actually going out and trying to graze some of the forage that's actually there. And so if you have a way to lock them out at night or to lock them out in the last half of the day, it can be a good option.
Emma, what are your top recommendations or things you'd really like cattle producers to take away from choosing hay feeders or feeding hay to their cattle?
Yeah, so I think testing your hay if you can is also a really important aspect, so that way the nutritional value, the TDN and the protein are two of the things that say if you're only going to look at two things, those are kind of my two favorite things to look at, so that way what you're actually providing for your cows, and just making sure that you have a feeder that works for your operation and works for your cattle. And like I said before, one of those nice options is adding a sheeted bottom. You kind of increase the productivity of those feeders and decrease some potential waste in a economic way.
As we round out today's conversation, are people located in or around Hays, Kansas, welcome to reach out to you with their beef cattle questions?
Absolutely.
What's the best way they can do that?
So my email is eabriggs@ksu.edu.
Emma, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Extension Beef Production Specialist Emma Briggs discussing choosing the right hay feeder. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out a Beef Tips article titled Choose the Right Hay Feeder to Reduce Waste and Cut Cost. You can find it linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to K-State Extension's beef website. That website is ksubeef.org. On there, you can find their Beef Tips newsletter and other resources related to beef cattle. I would also like to remind you that you are welcome to reach out to Emma, who is an extension beef production specialist in Hays, Kansas. Her email is eabriggs@ksu.edu. That is eabriggs@ksu.edu. I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll have this week's horticulture piece with Cynthia Domenghini.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. If you'd like to get a jump on the upcoming gardening season, you should consult the Kansas Garden Guide to determine when seed should be started for each vegetable. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini covers the basics of starting vegetable seeds. Cynthia, as we think about starting seeds, something that we can actually get done this time of year, the number one thing probably is really looking for those reputable seeds.
Exactly. Starting yourself off for success begins by sourcing your seeds from a reliable company. Typically, there are places that host seed exchanges. The concern that we have about using seeds that have been saved from a previous year's garden is the possibility of cross-pollination. And so you may not be too sure what you're actually going to end up growing. But, if you're up for an experiment and an adventure in the garden, that is an option as well, using the seeds that were saved over from last year. But typically starting with a reliable company is a really great way to start your garden off.
I guess the one thing we also need to know is when we need to start, right? Because there's some timing that goes into this.
Exactly. And I always direct people to the Kansas Garden Guide. There's a chart in the back of that book, which is available free online. And that chart tells you when it's time to plant the most popular varieties of vegetables. From there, you can count back how many weeks to start the seeds so that you're ready to put them in the garden at the right time.
Generally 4 to 8 weeks for most?
Exactly. We're typically looking at 4 to 8 weeks. And there are some vegetables that need to be direct seeded into the garden, so it's important to know that information. Things like beets and carrots, they don't transplant well. So starting seeds early for those indoors is not going to be very successful. Instead, things like cabbage and cauliflower, some of those that will develop a large head, they need to get started in February in order to reach maturity by the time the summer heat starts to set in.
So again, you want to check the garden guide.
Exactly. Check in with the garden guide. You can check the planting dates and then also read up on individual vegetables and the best strategies for whether transplanting or starting seeds directly in the garden.
We also want to think about the potting mixture then?
Exactly, yes. There's plenty of pre-made mixes that are available at most garden centers, and those are going to be a good way to get started with a disease-free light mix. You don't want anything that's going to be real heavy and get waterlogged because the seeds just aren't going to be able to germinate.
What do we need to keep in mind then as we're doing the containers and the lighting and the whole process, I guess?
Yeah, the containers, you have plenty of options with containers. And you can do things that are minimal to very low cost, like recycling containers, even the little K-cups that a lot of people use for making coffee and hot chocolate with the little Keurig machines. Those can work for starting seeds. Or you can purchase plug trays. Those are nice because each cell is not real big and they already have the drainage holes. The problem with having a container that's real large is if you put too much soil in and then you're watering, sometimes the seeds can be overwatered and they won't do well with those conditions. So really a shallow container is better for starting seeds. And then once you get to the point where you've got 2 to 4 leaves that have germinated, you can transplant into something larger, like a 4-inch container. So when you're starting your seeds, you also need to keep in mind that you want to keep the soil moist, not oversaturated, but moist, and keep the seeds in an area that has some lighting, probably supplemental lighting unless you've got a really great garden window, and they need to stay warm. So keeping it in a nice, warm, well-lit environment.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on how to start vegetable seeds. Again, for more information, consult the Kansas Garden Guide. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.